Hello everyone, you're with Business Insider. I'm Sriram Iyer and this is our special series, Budget Insider. And we are doing this on a historic day when the Sensex breached 50,000 for the first time ever. And all the excitement is cool as long as you made some money out of this. If not, then of course, FOMO is the word for you. Fear of missing out. Bajaj Auto posted its best quarter ever. 3 IPOs are underway. So many exciting things seem to be happening in corporate India and the stock market. And to talk about that, we have with us our smiling assassin, Deepak Shenoy, whose only weapon is his wit and nothing else. And also we have with us Aditi Nair joining us on Business Insider for the first time. For the first time at Business Insider, Aditi?
Yes, that's correct. Thank you for inviting me.
But you've watched us talk to each other on different platforms, other channels before. Thank you so much for taking time out. Aditi has been going through reams of depressing data over the last few months. So you know, and the reason why she's probably smiling now is because the December lot has been much better. And so while the legend goes that economists and stock market guys like Deepak can never agree on most things, I think there is some amount of optimism that both of them will share here today. But I hope and I'm sure that there will be very differing perspectives on what the budget can and must deliver. And just for the sake of drama, do disagree a little bit. And for the sake of sanity, do agree a little bit. On that note, let me start with you, Aditi. Is the data so good that Sensex should be past 50,000? Or, it is a bubble according to you as well?
I'm going to start off by saying that the Sensex and the asset markets in general look much further ahead than what the economists do. We look at the data that we're getting for now and try to look at how things are going to be 3 months, 6 months, 1 year, 2 years down the road. The Sensex generally tends to take a much longer term view of things and extrapolate data from today to where they think data and earnings are going to be several quarters later in terms of the PE, etc. So let's put that behind us and let me talk a little bit about what I actually see in the data that we've got of late. For sure, we've got optimism coming in through the December data. There has been a rebound from November. We expected November to be a dip, which was temporary, and that's what the December data is showing us. More than that, what we've got in the December data in terms of the monthly indicators that we track is that most of them have actually expanded on a year-on-year basis. So it's not just an improvement compared to where we were last month. Most of them are actually improving compared to where we were last year, which is pre-COVID. Therefore, what we now see is a tentative return to pre-COVID normalcy in many sectors. Granted, of course, that we're talking about only the formal sectors over here because it's very difficult to actually get hard data on the informal part of the economy. And therein lies a very major divide between what the stock markets are looking at. Clearly, they're looking at the formal part of the economy and the listed companies versus the economists like me who try to look at data from the formal sector and extrapolate it as best as we can to the informal sector as well to get a more macro view of where the country and the economy are heading.
But the informal sector data like your e-way bills and power supply and usage, they are also looking pretty good, isn't it?
Very good. In fact, the two most meaningful indicators of an economic revival that is more durable are the GST e-way bills as well as the rail freight data. So here the pace of growth is pretty high. And even in the month of January, it's either stable or it seems to be improving. And that's something that we see as a more meaningful indicator of an economic revival that is durable in nature. Similarly, for Q3 as a whole, we've got most indicators having shown a YOY expansion. And that again is something that's really important as an input for economists like me who need to figure out whether we're already out of the recession or are we only going to get out of the recession in the current quarter.
So the worst case scenario is the recession ends this quarter by March.
Yes.
That's fantastic. I think that's something that we can live with. I mean, especially considering that the last 6-8 months that we've seen. Deepak, you are a stock market guy, but you are also a very less excitable person. The last time we spoke, I remember I asked you, and that was I think 6 months ago or roughly around that time. And I asked you whether the market has already priced in Unlock 7.0. right?
Yes.
And since then, there has been no tempering of excitement. It's only gone from strength to strength, like a lot of television anchors like to say. Uh, is it a bubble yet, according to you?
Well, I mean, I don't think the concept of a bubble should be scary because markets are built for the extremes. You don't expect a market to, be exactly valued all of the time. You need those. So markets traditionally worldwide, no matter when it has been, you've always seen markets go oscillate to extreme bearishness at one level and extreme bullishness at the other. We're probably at the extreme bullishness, but so what? We might get even more bullish. And extreme bullishness gives a lot of people, the ability. Liquidity can actually solve a lot of issues that would otherwise be difficult to solve. To give you an example, if a company is valued very richly, it can issue equity at a higher rate, at a higher price, and actually make its balance sheet look a lot better. Simply because people are crazy enough to buy those shares at those extreme prices, and sometimes that feedback. So it's what George Soros calls reflexivity. The observer becomes the influencer of what he's observing. Is exactly what's happening here. You've got a lot of you've got a feeding frenzy.
You just took it to quantum physics.
Well, I mean, Soros is hardly a quantum physicist; he's a market player.
No. I'm saying this observer effect is also something that's spoken about in quantum. So yeah.
Yes, I mean, of course, you got
there because I don't know anything more.
Yeah, Heisenberg's uncertainty theory is the way you look at something or try to measure something changes the position of it in the first place. This is more about markets. So now, for instance, since we look at rating agencies to give us an idea of how a company is doing, companies go to court and say, don't allow the rating agency to downgrade us so that people can view us more favorably, which sounds like an oxymoron to anybody watching, saying, listen, this is supposed to be unbiased observation, but you're biasing it. And that's the way it is. But if you look at markets today, they're not really, I don't think they're reflections. I mean, I think Aditi is being very generous to markets in saying they price in the future. They price in anything really that you want them to price in. They can price the past in, future in, imaginary futures, anything that you want to, because you give me an Excel sheet, I'll give you a valuation for any company in India at whatever price. 150 times earnings, no problem. I'll just put some, every Indian is going to paint his house twice a year. And that's what my future says. And therefore, you should buy this paint company at 200 times earnings. So, yeah, I mean, you could do this ad nauseum, but really a bubble is only in hindsight. All bubbles end badly because that's the definition of a bubble. It's not a bubble if it hasn't ended badly. So the point is how it's going to end from here. I'll give you an example. Alan Greenspan in 1996 December said, and I did a tweet thread about this, saying the market is seeing some irrational exuberance. The market was making new highs, no doubt. The market then continued on another 30% up for another 1.5 years without a serious correction, and then corrected 20%. At the lowest point of that subsequent 20% correction was still 10% higher than where Greenspan made his comment, continued onward to make another 50% move up to 1999, and then broke back to roughly around where Greenspan had made his famous comment 5 or 6 years later. I don't think any of us has the patience to imagine that we could get out of markets right now just because there's overvaluation. Watch it go up 50-60% more and then come back down. So the point is, I can't predict that just because there's a bubble that the market will fall. If it's a bubble, it can become a bigger bubble. And, economics plays a role in terms of giving context, but sometimes it defies, markets defy context, right? So there's no reason for the markets to have kept going up when the economic indicators were getting worse, not getting better. And today, when they're getting better, the markets might just correct. Like we've seen today, 50,000 and back down with a flash. So, things happen. So don't give too much credit to markets. They're also, figments of imagination.
Definitely. But pretty much everything is, right? Since we are going on a light bit of taking tangential route once in a while. Democracy is an agreed upon imagination. Human rights is an agreed upon imagination. So are markets. If the markets agree, like you said, that the bubble can be bigger, then why not? But aren't you excited by what Aditi is saying about this? The fact that the recession might end, the latest that it can end by is March, and I don't think anybody has sort of articulated it in a direct way. That, I mean, the power of that headline for a media person is immense. So what can that do to the market when tomorrow this article comes on Business Insider?
Oh yeah, I mean, the point about whether markets will price that in is a different. If it goes down, we'll say it's priced in. If it goes up, we'll say, oh well, this was because the market. Well, we are like that, so just ignore us. But you see, the point over here is, does this make a difference to a large way? I think to a certain extent, markets have already started to realize that this impact of COVID and the resultant knockdown of the economy has hurt the informal sector a lot more than it has the formal sector. You've seen the formal sector is almost embodied by the public markets, right? So almost, because not all of it is. But there are some things in there that have been showing some kind of a positive trend. You've seen GST collections start to move up even before December. You've seen, I keep looking at the government revenue data. So although corporation taxes are still suffering, personal taxes are actually higher collected on a month-to-month basis, even in November. And December is when you have to typically pay a lot of taxes on a personal business point of view. But even November data is encouraging. Of course, excise duties have doubled because of
November also there was a lot of accumulated tax payment, right?
I mean, generally, if you look at October, November, the revenue data was pretty good on a small base, because it's always a small base when it's not an advanced tax month. But I think the important thing is government expenditure took off as well in those 2 months. And I'm hopeful that if that sustains in the last 4 months of the year, then actually we have something that's going to help power the economic rebound back, at least get us out of the recession.
Yes, there are indicators. I think you've got to look at, if you look at, say, L&T's, if you follow their corporate announcements, nothing for 4 months in some serious way. Suddenly, November end to December, he's announced like 7 receipts of orders and this and that. So there's activity happening where there was not so much. Maybe I'm using L&T as a proxy, but I think it's across the infrastructure
signal,
board.
Right? So why not? It is one of the biggest. It is the biggest construction and public works projects that it takes up at one of the biggest companies. So that's awesome. I mean, I think so. Basically, I think both of you are saying is we are going into this budget with a certain amount of optimism, which is not good news for the market or anybody, because there will be no stimulus. You don't get the parachute money.
Well, but does parachute money matter to markets? We've got enough. There's so much money lying around. We're not going to pay people like the US does. Okay, we don't have that. We might pay some people. We might forgive some loans, but I don't think there is any hope that everybody will get X amount of money in their bank accounts just because they were alive or they ended up alive after COVID. So I don't think that is happening. I mean, of course, I may be wrong completely. There might be exactly this proposal on the table, but I feel at best, India survives despite the government for the most part. So to that extent, we haven't. That's why we survive so well in general, even though everything seems so dysfunctional at times. And we talk about 500 approvals needed to start a company, but there are companies getting started every day. They're going through those 500 approvals. We're like, dude, whatever it takes. We are that kind of public, right? So we will recover regardless of whether, even if there was no government support, I think this economy would recover. Now you're getting some, which is good. But at best, at this point, we'll have to figure out if this budget actually means more than it has in the past. And I'm saying that because increasingly the budget becomes less and less important and meaningful to our lives, both personally, other than personal taxes, which I know will be like, that's the most watched section in the budget. Then we go through that drama just to listen to that, tera income tax zyada ho raha hai ki nahi. But the point here is, how does it affect the economy as a whole? Government expenditure now as a percentage of the GDP has, I don't think it has increased dramatically. It has in the last couple of years. I've seen some anomalies going in, but otherwise, private consumption continues to be the bulk of the economy, right? So it's not really the government expenditure that's driving it. Even the government is trying to mask its expenditure, pushing it through some of the companies it owns rather than by itself. So the budget itself may not necessarily be the game changer. What could happen is policies change. I mean, if they freed the rupee, for instance, created. So today, for instance, as a person, private person, I can't get together a bunch of people and get money together and fund other businesses. It's a pain. If you create a private limited company, it has to then be registered with the RBI as an NBFC. For me to just fund a few friends' companies, I mean, nowhere in the world is it so difficult to just pull together capital to invest in other people's businesses. I think that should change, and hopefully some of these rules.
And I think this is what Jim Rogers was mentioning in our chat just a couple of days ago. And he was like, I want to invest in India. I think it's one of the best countries in the world. I love traveling there. I love the food and there's so much potential. But if you want me to invest, please make it a little easier. I just can't. If I want to go invest in Germany, I'll just click a few buttons and it's done. But in India, that's not the case. And that's probably what Aditi, because I want to take a few threads from what Deepak said about whether there is a need for stimulus or not. What is your overall thought? And number two is, he said, of course, there might be some stimulus for some sections of the economy, some set of people. Who are those people? I mean, I'm assuming the people most in pain. And where is the maximum amount of pain in this economy, in this society?
Look, I think the maximum amount of pain is clearly with the people who were in the informal part of the contact intensive sector and contact intensive in general. The people who worked in our offices for cleaning, the people who worked as support staff in restaurants that we stopped going to, and a whole host of the support services that have just seen their livelihoods disappear in front of their eyes in the last several months. So if we need to provide a stimulus, if we need to provide income support, food support, that's really where we need to, really target the limited fiscal space which is available. In my view, broad, umbrella parachute money, this isn't the time for it. If we had to do it, we should have done it a lot earlier before we were even clear on who was going to be badly affected. But
Anyway,
they were much
20
better.
lakh crore Atmanirbhar Bharat, are you not buying it? Is that what you're saying?
No, I as an economist, I totally support the fact that free food was given for such a long period of time. I think that was a very well intended and hopefully very well received part of Atmanirbhar Bharat that really helped those people who were the worst off during the crisis. So, to my mind, that was a very well targeted, part of Atmanirbhar Bharat in terms of actually providing an umbrella support of providing social security. Similarly, looking at the districts where people had gone back, really just increasing the outlays for Narega, all of these are easy things for the government to do in a crisis that nobody has any idea how it's going to unfold or how long we're actually going to
I
be.
think Narega was effective, definitely. Food was effective. But what about industry? MSME loans were effective, I suppose. But I don't know what the repercussions of that, how much of that loan will actually come back. We don't know. But yeah, so in terms of, so when you say these informal sections of the society, your support staff, your other services, people in services, restaurants, school bus drivers, that is a big, and I get letters from emails from, people who are there is a union of folks who dig borewells or something like that. And they are in and they are like, we are asking for this, blah, blah, blah. And some very interesting set of people who are not visible to our elite societies, our lives on a day-to-day basis. So what will be the structure? I mean, is it going to be an income support? And if they do, then you can't leave away farmers, you can't leave away, other sections of the society that are getting subsidized in some form or the other, either because of political compulsions or being identified as a segment over a long period of time. So what can be the structure, and have you heard anything that is possible?
Well, I haven't heard anything. I have some ideas. I think certainly, we do think that getting a good amount of allocation of funding for Narega is always a good backup plan. We don't know how things are going to pan out. We don't know if the monsoon is going to be normal again, or if we're heading in for a year of a bad monsoon. So having allocation in place for Narega just allows you that amount of social security that if people ask for it, if they need that work can be made available. Similarly, maybe it's time to now look at an urban version of Narega. All those people who are still in the hinterland, not sure whether their job exists, if they come back, rent will start immediately. At least if they have that assurance that they can come in and look at some kind of employment under an urban Narega, people will have the confidence to come back to the urban areas. And then at least our labor force starts to get replenished. And that perhaps is something that could be fairly positive in terms of the stage of the recovery that we're at. It'll restart remittances back to the rural areas. It'll get urban consumption humming, at least at the bottom of the pyramid. And I think the problem is at the bottom of the pyramid now. A lot of other segments of society may not be as nervous as they were at the height of the lockdown or right after that. And what we expect in FY22 is a very differentiated recovery. Different sectors, different age groups, and different strata of society are going to see a variable return of confidence and consumption and spending in FY22 compared to where we are right now.
Awesome. Because just yesterday we had Mahesh Vyas in a similar chat, and he made the exact same recommendation that you did. Manrega for urban unemployed. I want to, before I go to Deepak, because I had my next question lined up, but I want to go back to this point. And because at Business Insider, we don't like to just throw things at people and then force them to Google. We will be the Google. Why don't you just tell us what will this urban Manrega look like? Who is it for? What kind of jobs can be given? What can people, if there is an announcement, there is an image that people can sort of put together immediately?
Some sort of a public works program. That's what the rural Narega is as well.
So like Mahesh said, that it can be for, let's say, security purposes, right? You have a lot of areas which are not really covered well or protected well by the police department, is slightly far flung, not very active. Other services like things like what Urban Lab does, right? Can we create a government kind of a model for those services? Barbers, carpenters, electricians. So just talk to us a little bit about what is the image in your head.
Well, definitely not security. I don't think we have that in mind, that we have sort of temporary, if you need a job requirement.
So I asked him, I also said, so do you mean Romeo Squad like in UP? So he said, no.
But it will become that.
No, but anyway, yeah. So let's, any of you, just jump on it. What do you think when you say Manrega for urban unemployed?
My view is something like an urban public works program, and maybe also support staff in terms of the urban service provision, which, the urban local bodies tend to always be strapped for funds. So if they can get in some karamcharis or some other kind of help coming in where they don't have to pay the bills, where maybe the training is not very difficult for them to impart, then that's something that could work out. And again, we have to keep in mind that this is going to be the people will decide whether they need these jobs and whether they need that income, and that is going to determine how much of outflow there will actually be under a scheme like this. So if the economy revives and the private sector jobs at the entry level start to revive very sharply, then the requirement of actually paying out salaries under this scheme will automatically go down. It's insurance for people, and I think it's something that definitely Narega for the rural areas has served us well. No matter how much we have debated it over the last several years, I think it's basic social security and basic insurance. And it will be interesting if we can design a scheme for the urban areas that extends that insurance to the urban areas as well.
So, I think last April I was writing one column for BPI, and this was about unemployment and trying to provide. Can we do a US style paycheck program what is the alternative. And I was talking to one of my mentors, senior journalists. I don't want to name him here because he said something very interesting. He said, market journalists like me completely trampled upon the concept of Manrega when it was announced. And today we are so sorry for having done that. It is the only saving grace for a big section of the society. So yeah, that thought I think is now sort of accepted. Even
As an economist, I am much more in favor of a jobs program than just a blank check.
Yeah. So Deepak, what about you? What are your thoughts? Do you want to sort of continue from where Aditi left off, or should I ask you? She described varying levels of recovery across sectors, across age groups, across social strata. From a stock market point of view, where do you see the maximum amount of pain?
Well, I'm not in favor personally from Manrega kind of urban jobs program, but I do think urban projects at a project level. I'll give you an example. Mumbai floods every year. And every year they give us some spiel about how the water is so much. And it rains more in Singapore. They figured it out. And if you've got a problem of getting people back to work, why don't we create a program? We have the engineering knowledge, strength. We have the people who can work on it. Why don't we? And if you want to fund, if we can fund it, why don't we do that? Delhi has pollution and fog every year, and every year we say some farmers are doing something to their tree stumps at the end of the planting season, and they're doing it because they don't have the money to kind of take them out and make them into mulch. And use the money, get people to put them on the task and reduce the fog in Delhi and all of that stuff, right? So you actually could do a lot of these things, even that will help urban areas. But on a project basis, I don't think a permanent. I'm not in favor. I mean, I haven't been in favor of Manrega either. And to me, there have been alternative thoughts about that. I'm not in favor of food subsidies either, to be fair. I mean, I just feel that some of this just economically burdens us because of opportunities lost. We spend next to nothing on education. We spend 100 times that on everything else of this sort. You could argue that without food, there's no education, but then this is food that does not translate into food for the most part. It translates into rotting stuff, but we want to change a little bit more efficiency in the outcome based in terms of the subsidies that we give. I think it would go a long way. Bangalore, for instance, has its challenges, although it has great weather, and everybody who goes to Bangalore really talks about the weather, but not about the fact that we have lousy infrastructure.
Weather and masala dosa.
And masala dosa. And if you can get to the hotel to the masala dosa without a puncture, then you have the masala. But the point is that it's just such terrible roads for what is supposed to be one of India's fastest growing cities or whatever it is. And I mean, every city has these challenges, right? So you could do some of that. And believe me, that'll help the stock market, because if I can get to work in a less troubled fashion, my productivity will increase at some level. Everything will go better. Things just get better that way.
So I got it. You disagree with the Manrega, whether rural or urban. Yes. I mean, it's an argument, but for a lot of people who have survived this crisis because of that will disagree. And we have seen.
No. I mean, I think at a time like this, you cannot disagree with such programs. There's the times that but you could not have created Manrega for COVID, right? It was not created for COVID. It was created for normal times. And that's where I disagree with it. But in a COVID-like time frame, having that infrastructure ready to be able to provide more support to such people, I think definitely acceptable. You could disagree with it conceptually, but agree with it in parts, at times, at extremes. And this is an extreme. There's no doubt about it.
So let's come back to other parts of corporate India where the pain is and what can be done. What are the spots that you have identified that need instant stimulus?
Well, I think to a certain extent, I think informal economy has to come back up. There is a lot of stress, and we've seen the RBI report also that talks about it. This is in latent stress in the economy. We're not seeing it because the Supreme Court has literally said no more NPAs until we give you an order, which typically means now everybody is now starting to talk about, look, my NPAs are 0.6%, but if I looked at the If I did disregarded the SBI Supreme Court order, it would be at 3%. This means there's stress, and that stress is now in retail more than it is in wholesale and corporate loans. Corporate loans have not grown as a size in any meaningful way since 2015. The corporates have been deleveraging, fixing their balance sheets for the last 5 or 6 years. Hardly any fresh investment. A lot of them are still operating under capacity. So there's not that much fresh capex coming in. A lot of the capex is actually.
So I just want to, as a counterpoint, which we picked up from, again, one of the conversations as part of this series, Nilesh Shah was explaining to us, and he said it's not because companies are not investing. Companies are investing. Tata's, Birla's, Ambani's are setting up capacity. Hindalco is doing expansion. L&T is taking up projects. There is capital coming in. The fixed capital formation is down because household savings are down and household investments are down. That's his reading, unless I'm sort of paraphrasing it incorrectly.
Well, it's got to come out somewhere, I guess. But the point is, a lot of capex is actually disguised as opex.
Okay.
In a different way. It's just the way things are. I'll give you an example. A company like Uber would traditionally have owned all the taxis they had, right? So this would be a large investment. They would do this. They would put the fixed assets on their, on their accounts and so on. Or maybe fortunately, they're able to build a very large network of people who finance their own cars, which does not get translated. It can be translated as consumption, may not necessarily come in as investment.
Okay.
Because of the way individuals are. You can't figure out if I own a car for X or Y.
The funny bit about Uber is and Ola, what all the cab ride-hailing services is, especially in cities like Bombay and Delhi, it's not the driver who owns the car, not Uber. There is a travel agency which doubles up, and he has a fleet of 50 cars, and all the drivers are his employees, and he runs it on shifts. And that is an interesting model that is not being spoken about in the media.
That happens, but that's not the only thing. So you can have both models. You can have drivers themselves owning 2 cars, one that they drive. So there is a bit of a fleet approach here, and that would be a nice way to do organized capital. Though, by the way, regulations make that a nightmare for anybody to set up a formal company to do this, which is unfortunate, but that's the way it is. But so a lot of the stuff that happens around here, and I mean, we've seen it in the conversations. This now becomes a lot of things around this area is like about how many rides you've done, how many this thing. But the competition kept the game going. It was a lot of people that were coming in and all that. But I'm just talking about the economic impact of this. Earlier, the economic impact would have been a large company that got hit by COVID, like Carnival Cruises did in the US, where you would have a big hit to a large balance sheet where the banks were willing to negotiate, give you longer lead times for your loans because you were a large exposure. Now there are lots of little exposures. We don't know who's negotiating with what, and are they actually giving them any relief? Remember, the RBI gave a time window. They said, go renegotiate your loans, extend tenures. You won't have to call them NPAs. If you don't, you restructure those loans before December 31st, 2020, they didn't go and restructure them, which means that the little Uber driver who probably needed that help, he wasn't getting as much, hasn't got any relief from the banks, even though the banks have got a huge amount of relief from the RBI, from, forbearance of all sorts, more liquidity, unheard of liquidity in a lot of ways, but still they haven't translated down that into even a lower interest rate for the car borrower, because, then they'll have to restructure it and take a hit on their balance sheet. So this is actually a sad thing that has happened. That translation of all the stuff that you're doing for the banking system has not translated to a better deal for the little guy. They also don't introduce competition. So all the banks behave in this rude, obnoxious manner. And I'm sorry to say this, but this is the way it is. But
that's the fact of life, right? You borrow 100 rupees from a bank, it's your problem. You borrow 100 crores, it's the bank's problem. So
yeah, I mean, if the Uber drivers of the country came together and formed a union and said, "Nahi dega paisa wapas, now you negotiate with us as a team," things would happen. Unfortunately, things didn't, and you have COVID, you can't get together anywhere, and all sorts of things. But the point over here is, there is this translation difference. I hope in this budget they try to at least help address some of that. I don't know how it can be done without forcing a bank to lend at a lower rate. I don't know how it can be done, but perhaps there is a need for competition here. There is a need for people to be,
You mean competition amongst banks?
Amongst banks. So they don't compete. One bank is, I'm exclusively auto lending thing. Another fellow says, I'm exclusively tractor lending thing. Look, we are a larger system than most of this. We have NBFCs.
It's like beat reporters among journalists.
In a way. But I guess it's such a big economy, and we have a few banks, right? And they own majority of this. And each of them says, I don't want to lend, I don't want to do this, I don't want to do that. You can go and give a fixed deposit as a security, and the banks will give you a loan. But if you have something else as a collateral, which is as liquid, like even a liquid fund, half the banks don't even know how to start giving you a loan. And there are few that operate. So even secured loans, loans against vehicles, we've seen yesterday a big lender came in and said, I have 11% auto NPAs. What this is going to mean is that all the other banks are going to look at this data and say, abhi nahi lend karega, auto mein lend nahi karega. This is a problem because the NPAs come because they're not reducing rates. Although their input rates have come down to 4.5-5% in a lot of cases, they're not translating that back onto the borrowers. They just want them to extend their tenure at the same interest rate. But I haven't heard of people going proactively cutting rates. I had a friend yesterday call me up and said, this bank is offering me an X amount, very large number of loan at 7%. He doesn't even need the money. And he's saying, can I put it in some government bond that gives me more than 7%? So I was like, good point. But, you don't need the money and you're getting the loan at 7. I've just, in the last month, there was this.
Isn't there an end use compulsion? What are you taking that loan for? I am very naive, so please educate me.
There is officially an end use of it that is there. There is one, but the banking system can invent their own balance sheet, and to a very large extent, these things are driven by targets for each individual manager.
Aditi, jump in if you want to say. I can see you like bursting out with comments.
I'm staying away from this.
No, I won't accuse any bank of doing this, but I accuse all of them. Because, look, if they're telling us that all these defaults have happened and they didn't know, suddenly this rating agency has rated it down and we didn't know everything went. Come on, you knew. And a lot of things were stuff that you know. And we don't harm you because you're too big to fail. But otherwise, they would be. It hasn't happened worldwide, so I shouldn't say anything. Nobody has gone to jail.
We had a fun, long explanation, but I want to summarize this into 2 lines. So you're saying that the government should push banks to pass on the benefit of all the stimulus that has already been given, whether in terms of higher allocation for loans or restructuring opportunities, right? It should be more efficiently used. Aditi, when we watch movies, we can abuse politicians without naming them. So take that opportunity with banks also if you want. Like any politician is fine. Just don't get specific.
No, I think, this is not a topic that I'm as comfortable as Deepak talking about. So let's come back to what I think can and can't and should and shouldn't be part of budget expectation. As an economist, for me, budget is a statement of receipts and expenditure. And in India, we end up having so much hype around budgets as if it's the only day of the year where reforms can be announced. It's the only day of the year that is going to determine our financial future for the next fiscal year. That isn't the case, and that shouldn't be the case. So I think, first of all, we need to have very practical expectations from what a budget is meant to be and what can be there of the worst crisis, but we're still looking at a whole lot of uncertainty going into next year. So it needs to be a very practical budget. We need to have very credible revenue assumptions. Otherwise, the market is just going to sit and second guess and rip apart every revenue assumption that has been made and say that this just is incredible. And what will happen is that bond yields will start going up. that's something that we don't want to
I
see.
think also that's a good important bit, and I was telling my team also. I mean, I want to. We were discussing, and the idea is that on that day when those FY21 numbers are announced, there's going to be panic in every newsroom because every the revised estimates are going to be horribly lower, and we need to sort of put a reality check there and say that okay, no, it's okay. Uh, what are your thoughts there? How do we deal with it as journalists?
So let me share my estimates for FY21 and for FY22 so that we have some basis to be able to form our thoughts about how the budget what actually gets presented in the budget. So for FY21, we now expect a shortfall in tax revenues relative to what was budgeted for FY21 to be about 20%. And there's going to be changes in the central tax devolution, etc., etc., etc. But net, we are looking at a shortfall, large shortfall, but not as bad as what we were fearing at the height of the lockdown. Secondly, non-tax revenues and disinvestment proceeds is going to be a large shortfall over there as well. What COVID has done is create a revenue shock, both for the central government and for the state governments. How have they responded? By cutting back on expenditure that was deemed to be less necessary, keeping space for expenditure that needed to be undertaken to offset at least some of the pain of the crisis, and borrowings have gone up. And obviously, the fiscal deficit is going to be a lot higher than what was expected in the pre-COVID times. We now expect the FY21 fiscal deficit to be 14.5 trillion. And this is 7.5% of our estimate of this year's nominal GDP, which is a contraction of 4.5% over the level that was there in FY20. So that's the base that we're pegging FY21. For FY22, we're going to work backwards and forwards. So our expectation is that GDP is nominally going to grow by about 10% next year, 10.1% to be exact. Sorry, that's the real GDP growth, and the nominal GDP expansion will be around 14%. So we expect tax revenues will grow by at least 14% next year. So there will be a normalization. Things like the windfall of excise obviously creates a huge base, and some of the deep pain that we saw in the current year will also reverse in FY22. So net, we are looking at a 14% growth in tax revenues, subdued increase in non-tax revenues. We don't see any avenues for non-tax revenues to go up very sharply, but capital receipts, definitely, we've got a healthy pipeline of disinvestment. And if we are able to actually get some large transactions concluded in FY22, then certainly there could be a large amount of money that can be generated through the disinvestment.
So we
can put lots of numbers on it.
This FY22.
FY22. So for the sake of our analysis, we have pegged disinvestment receipts at 1.5 trillion. That's less than what was budgeted for this year. So I'm not looking at an outlandish number. We do have large ticket deals which have been in the pipeline. The question is, will they fructify in FY22 or get delayed even further, effectively? Now, in terms of then from the revenue side, we move to where we think the fiscal deficits could be pegged at the levels which are acceptable to the markets and at levels where the borrowings are again digestible by the markets. So the view we formed is that if we get the fiscal deficit to come back to about 5% of GDP next year, from 7.5% of GDP this year, that's a very good fiscal correction, and a lot of it is simply going to come on the back of revenue normalization. Secondly, we could look at the revenue deficit coming back to 3.5% of GDP. It's completely gone out of hand this year. It had to, because the revenues have collapsed. So getting the revenue deficit back to 3.5% of GDP, this means that revenue expenditure will contract compared to our estimate for FY21, but some of the fiscal stimulus programs will end. Like, for example, we don't expect fertilizer subsidy to be as large in FY22 as the additional allocation which is being made over and above what was budgeted. So we've effectively got twice as much fertilizer subsidy that is being planned for this year as compared to the original budget estimate, and we don't expect that to continue next year. So there will be some programs that will cease, which will allow revenue expenditure to come back to a slightly lower level. And if this investment can indeed go up to about 1.5 trillion, we think that there is space for capital expenditure on budget by Government of India by itself, not inclusive of what the public sector enterprises are going to do. for that capex to go up to about 4.8 trillion, which is a 30% increase over what we have estimated for the current year. So this is the broad set of fiscal numbers that we're looking at, starting with the revenue normalization, levels of fiscal deficit that will be acceptable, and how much expenditure that then allows the government to be able to undertake.
So 20% fall in tax revenue, 7.5% fiscal deficit,
20% shortfall compared to
shortfall in tax revenue, 20% less than what the government had expected to earn, and 7.5% fiscal deficit, and we still have 3 months if they can make good with any of the disinvestments. Disinvestment has been a common theme in all our conversations, because the understanding is that we need money. The government needs money to spend. It's not going to come from tax revenue. So might as well sell some of the assets and make good for the shortfall of revenue, make good, bring in the money that you can spend on the informal sector, give people Manrega or whatever form of support that you can. So Deepak, to you, what is it looking like? I mean, at 50,000 Sensex, if not now, then when?
True, but it's not. PSU companies have not really gone up that much. The government has no strategy that is meaningful. In order, they don't even sell their ITC shares. Forget the public sector units here. They crib and scream and shout. And I'm like, I don't even understand this point. But the point is this: you have a BPCL, you probably have suitors. You say that. I say that because I have not seen somebody openly out there saying, listen, I am part of a bidding consortium for BPCL. Of course, there are people who make statements, but no concrete thing here. I hope that goes through, because they've got a Concord, they've got a BEML perhaps, they've got LIC. And you know, these are very attractive companies.
What has been the progress in LIC? Is there, I mean, are we likely to hear anything in this budget?
Well, they've said they'll do the IPO, but at best they can say we'll do the IPO next year. But I mean,
they can't say like, you know, the process has started, or, you know, just some kind of statement. I
mean, at this point, the only thing that I will believe the government is when they file the DRHP for LIC and SEBI approves it, and then it actually comes on and it actually finishes. I mean, that's the level of trust I have in the disinvestment process, right? So I'm like, I don't know what they will.
And it is not just this government. Any government has struggled with this.
Yeah, and you know, sometimes it's nonsensical, but you know, I have proposed a simple thing. You've got shares that you want to sell, and your problem is that the minute you say that you're going to sell shares, the market drops the price, and you get a lousy price. You don't feel like doing it again. You could create like drip irrigation, a drip disinvestment program. A drip disinvestment is just the ability to get some of our brightest engineers to design algorithms that just goes and sells a little bit of shares every day in the market quite silently looking. And there are ways to do this. This is not new. People who have large blocks of shares to sell do use algorithms to slowly feed them out into the market. We could build these things and have at least some part.
Use the 21-day SEBI window for disclosure.
Yeah, I mean, look, it's the government. What are you going to do? Find them? I mean, in the end, you could create this and tell SEBI, listen, we are doing it. We are going to do this all over the place. The disclosure norm will not apply to such. It's fine. Why should disclosure norms of the government selling stake have any impact? It's our money in the end. Do it silently because you abuse the process otherwise. So I don't mind that as much as I mind the fact that this kind of thinking hasn't really permeated in 6,000 crores is all they say they've earned. Okay, and I think that is it's a sneeze really for the markets. And in times like this, where certain shares you actually invest more. I'll give you an example. They did an IPO of IRFC. In IRFC's IPO, they have raised 3,000 crores in the IPO. The government hasn't sold shares. What they did last year was put 2,500 crores into IRFC. And IRFC, which normally would have been paying 400 or 500 crores of taxes because of what happened 2 years ago when they removed the MAT and gave a lower rate. They said because of one of the quirks of that, IRFC pays no taxes also. So effectively, IRFC got another 3,000 crores from the government, despite having collected 3,000 crores from us, or could have collected 3,000 crores from us in this process. So hopefully some of these thought processes will evolve into a better architecture going forward. I think we could do a lot more with disinvestment, both in companies that are already listed and the government stake is high, and in other cases where government stake is available in private companies. Hindustan Zinc, for instance, ITC through the SUUTI, for instance. There is a lot of scope there where they own stakes which can be, and you know what, a better time than COVID, because you need the money and you need it to rebuild the economy, and you know that there's a part of the economy that is not listed, that is hit. What's also going to happen, or quite likely, is that the stock markets will likely get taxed as well. So think of it, everything is suffering, stock market is doing fantastic, traders are paying 10% taxes or 15% taxes, where everybody else is paying 35, 42, whatever it is. What are the chances they won't tax capital gains a little bit more? But then to do that and at the same time target a high disinvestment may be an oxymoron, but I'm sure there will be a bit of both and attempts to do a little bit of both. I just hope that there's a better thinking that goes with it. They're talking about a dream budget. Let's hope it is one.
So, okay, we're almost 45 minutes past and I still have a couple of questions. I hope you guys have another 5 minutes.
Sure.
Let's just quickly run through it. Okay, quickly on the question of ITC, etc. And I want to sort of come to that because it struck me. This again, ITC is one of those sections which the government will try to squeeze. I mean, it's a stated objective because they want to sort of crack down on tobacco consumption, but at the same time, it's a cash cow. It gives you so much revenue as one company, as a sector. How do you? What is the outlook looking like there? I mean, is it going to be a bad budget for ITC as well?
So ITC every year gets
ITC shares will fall if the government says I will sell the stake. ITC shares will fall if it decides to increase the duties on cigarettes. ITC shares will fall if they say that the code of conduct is in place and then the policy is going to be implemented. There are like too many risks sort of piled up.
So ITC shares always fall before the budget and always go up after, despite any increase in taxes, because people know it's an addictive product. Until you ban it, you're going to find people saying, I'll pay more for the cigarette and I'll buy a little less medicine. Literally, that is how it's going to translate, right? So I don't know. I mean, the government says, oh, we can't ban it because of blah, blah, blah. But then your problem is that if you ban it, all the tobacco farmers and the workers in those farms are going to need a lot more Manrega than you think. So they're going to say, okay, we lose the taxes. We'll also have to finance those jobs. I mean, the lack of those jobs. And so we allow the poison to continue because, of these reasons. But really, ITC is one of those things where no matter what happens, people give it the short end of that stick before the budget. And after the budget, they're like, oh, we were too bearish. People are going to smoke anyways. Why don't we? So it's going to go back to that. The stake sale specifically does not need budgetary approval. It is not a budget thing.
No, but like it might be visible in the projections is what I'm trying to say.
I haven't seen it as a number that they've plugged. It used to be 70,000 crores in SUUTI. I don't think, I'm not sure though. I don't remember it being as a specific part of.
No, what I'm saying is that when they talk about it and they'll be like, okay, this year we are going to sell, then the assumption is ITC jayega and those kind of things.
As a stock market person, I think the worst thing to tell people is that you're going to sell a share.
Yeah.
Literally, because that instantly gives the market, excuse me, we're going to bring the prices down because you're going to sell it. So you should sell it and say, oh, I sold it. And that's how you should do this for all of the government stake sales, unless you're doing something strategic like BPCL. What's the point of telling people I am going to sell a share? Because when somebody knows that you have to sell it because you need the money for something else, they know that you're not looking at like the best price for it. ITC was in this fantastic run all this time. They never sold it during that time. And they'll let it come down to this level and then say, my funda is, it doesn't matter. Just sell it even now. It's okay. But the fear of I don't know what the fear is also. Earlier it used to be the fear that BAT will take over. Now they have rules against BAT taking over, so they can't be the so and L&T itself, as part of its employee welfare trust, which is a misnomer for L&T, owns 10% of itself because of the Ambani takeover battle that was there in the 90s. So I think I don't think these stocks should be protected. L&T has that, and government owned L&T shares. So I don't know if they still do, but this whole the structure is not really required. We could have ITC easily be sold, and a lot of companies where the government owns shares that can be sold. By the way, that I think there are a lot of these unclaimed dividends, I think, or something like that sit with the RBI in certain accounts, or unclaimed deposits, something like that. That sits a fairly large number that sits in there. This is actually if it sits in the RBI, it does nothing. This should be money that the government should effectively be using as a borrowing, rather than having that sit with the RBI. There are ways and mechanisms to make this done.
From one answer, I'm running out of time. Aditi, I just want to. I don't know. I will give you options to choose from. Right. One is we spoke about ITC, and therefore we spoke about the cigarette split. So we have to also talk about the travel, tourism, hotels, hospitality, which you track closely, you have a view on. Number two is this whole RBI, the funds from RBI, resources from RBI, how wisely to use it, which basically I'm also, there's one of the story pages my reporter came with, because she read somewhere who said that RBI spends 3% of the GDP amount in funding other countries. Why does it do it? Why do it during a pandemic and those kind of things? Number three, anything, a bad bank, for example, right? Just pick 1, 2, 3, just go for it.
Okay, let me start with the first one. See, as far as travel and tourism is concerned, we are seeing some optimism coming back. We've seen the occupancies going up in specific markets like Delhi and Mumbai, where people want to now go in and have staycation, and destinations that are driving distance from cities like Delhi and Mumbai, where we have maybe boutique hotels, spas, and things like that, where people can drive down, feel reasonably socially isolated, and have a little bit of a break and come back. But despite the fact that in some markets like this, occupancies are going up, the ARR, which is the average room rate, is still 30 to 40% below what it used to be. So it is only a partial recovery, and it's only in some markets. My view is that if we look ahead, there will be some normalization of some travel, some leisure travel, discretionary travel will eventually start coming back as people start to feel less nervous or just fatigued, just fed up of sitting in their homes and not having a break. So depending on how much of a risk you think is worth taking, some people may start doing a little bit of simpler travel, avoiding flights maybe, but going in for driving vacation. But I think fundamentally what is going to change is that business travel isn't going to come back in a hurry. And I think that is something that is going to affect both the airline sector as well as the hotel sector. That's possibly going to take a lot longer to revive than most of the other parts of the tourism economy. And I'm just going to give you one insight. I think one of my biggest learnings through this entire phase is that I was eating out far too much. My office is in Cyber City, next to Cyber Hub in Gurgaon. We're spoiled for choice. And certainly it was just easy to eat out often. And I think that's my personal learning through
I
the
want
last
to tie this
9
back
months.
to what Deepak said. Eating at Cyber City is great. Reaching there is a pain. Yeah. So then the second one is, I don't know. I mean, if it just struck me because we were talking about RBI resources. I haven't researched it myself, but the pitch was that why does RBI spend about 3% of its GDP on funding other countries and relief measures, etc. What is that thought there?
So, in my not too long career as an economist, I've seen lots of cycles of either people, cribbing that RBI isn't doing enough to build reserves and protect us from a crisis, or saying that the RBI is just too conservative. Why do we need all this money sitting in foreign exchange reserves? It's a waste. We should use it here. We should use it there. Just until we reach that stage again, where we are again concerned that we're going to have, major depreciation ahead of us. So I think this is a cycle. I've already seen it in my career several times, where we swing from one extreme to the other about what the RBI should do with forex reserve. It's macro prudential security that the RBI offers us. And I think what the governor said this past weekend in his recent speech is very interesting. We have to fend for ourselves in terms of, nobody would have expected this much money to come in so soon after COVID. Right? So the markets are being driven not only by optimism, but by liquidity. There's a huge amount of liquidity sloshing around globally, and a lot of it is coming into our market. And with that, it's bringing in the influx of foreign funds at a time where our imports haven't really quite recovered. So our current account is in a surplus. And we've got lots and lots of hot money, let's just call it hot money for now, coming in through the equity route through the FDIs. So what do? We have to figure out how to absorb it. And if we don't want the rupee to just appreciate and take away that export competitiveness, at some point the solution is that the foreign exchange reserves are going to go up. And we've seen a massive accretion this year. But it's been a really strange year where despite COVID, we've got all this money coming into our forex markets and some good FDI deals as well. So it's not only the FDI money, but again, the FDI money, the large block deals that have been done by some large corporations have also brought in a lot of money.
Yep.
And yes, it has meant that a lot of the forex reserves end up in very low yield earning treasuries, effectively, as your colleague calls it, funding foreign countries. But that is a corollary of actually having foreign exchange reserves that prevent us from the next.
It just struck me, and it's something definitely I need to read up on. I'm not aware of it, I'll admit that. Okay, last answer, final, my promise. Bad bank, good idea, bad idea. Both of you, one after the other.
That's for the.
Huh?
That's for Deepak.
Okay.
Okay, so a bad bank is just going to be a place where banks are going to dump all their assets. They're going to call them bad if they have to, because if I was a lender to a bank and my competitor, I was a borrower from a bank, large corporate, and you're taking my competitor's loans and dumping it to a bad bank and allowing him to survive, you go to the bank and say, "Mereko bhi bad banao na." Then you can dump my loans also. Why are you giving him I was this nice guy, paid you all these loans, and you now rescue my competitor take him to the cleaners. He's not done his capital efficiency well. But no, you don't want to do that because it hurts your balance sheet. So you take my taxpayer money, build a bad bank, put the assets there, and make him survive when I have to continue to pay my loans and be nice about it. Why should I? If you create a bad bank, it will be the only bank left. I think it's perfectly legal because at that time, everybody should default on the loans.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. This is why I love to have you both in these conversations. I hope you enjoyed it too. I hope it wasn't boring. It wasn't just budget talk. I hope we had fun while at it. And that is how we can take these kind of conversations to younger people who sit on a platform like Business Insider. They don't like feel like sitting in an economics class or be reminded with percentages that they don't know maths or they're not good at it. So yeah, while we take important information to them, we also try to make it palatable, give it that podcasty feel, so that at least some people will get interested each time and vote on the economy the next time. Thank you so much for watching Budget Insider. This is Sriram Iyer signing off.